and welcome everyone to our SciSep webinar for this month, titled Closing the Chasm Between Native Community Priorities in Cancer Prevention and Healthcare Research Priorities. We are very excited to have Dr. Wescott join us today for the presentation. And here is Dr. Wescott's traditional bio. As you can see here, I will not read through this, but thanks to Tim, we're trying a new, more fun way to get to know the presenter a bit better. And we asked Dr. Wescott to provide us a few fun facts about herself that might not make it in a typical bio. So the first one, in 2020, Dr. Wescott was profiled in The Lancet and named by the Boston Globe's Stat News division to the inaugural Starters list, which is fantastic. The first to hold the endowed professorship in American Indian Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Congratulations. Dr. Wescott was a cancer educator for Alaska Natives between 1999 and 2001. And that sure informs part of our presentation today. First quality talk speaker to use beach balls to make a statistical point, which I think that's a really strong skill set to have. That looks like the fun presentation. And at age 35 was the oldest in her Harvard Medical School class, which is, again, strong accomplishment there. So looking forward to the rest of the presentation. As Tim mentioned, we'll be using the poll EV to promote engagement throughout the presentation, ask some fun or interesting questions, and then an opportunity also at the end for more feedback. So we just want to test that a little bit. If you can all go text UNCLCN to 22333 or join online and answer this question. Hopefully you all have been attending a few of these webinars and know all about SciSep. But if you could go to the Poll EV site and answer this, I'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll look at the answer. All right, great, thanks. So we have the usual disclosures here, and Dr. Wescott has no relevant financial relationships. Okay. Oh. Okay, so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Wescott to take it away with the presentation. Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and it's so lovely to be here with you. This is a little bit of an unusual talk because I'm trying to really narrow in on a problem that I found when I was a cancer educator in Alaska, that there seemed to be research priorities and there were community priorities, and they really were nowhere near each other. So this talk is, I do use references and there is science here, but really what I'm trying to get is more things that are on the fringe of what is in the literature and really should be more discussed. So that's why it's called Closing the Chasm, and that chasm is between the Native communities and really a lot of other disenfranchised communities and the healthcare research and for what the priority should be in researching cancer risks or prevention. Okay, so we're going to start with the poll everywhere question. We'd have the pretty picture and then we'll have the actual question. But just think about, name what you think cancer risks are. And poll everywhere is a little bit interesting. It uses you can only use one word, but if you use an underscore, you can add more words in. So there we go. We're starting to get our word cloud going. I love smoking is the first thing, of course, and I know we have a variety of different healthcare levels here, and I will tell you the best questions I got were from community health aides when I was a cancer educator. So been a good mix. Smoking is popular. It's a little hard because vaping is making it more we used to be able to just say smoking. A little more complicated now. Tobacco use is not really very helpful because it's also, there's a lot of misconceptions that vaping is just flavored water. And you're like, yeah, you don't get addicted to flavored water, people. It's tobacco. All right, genetics is coming up. All right, I'll give it just a few more seconds. Because remember what you put in there and then think it helps you with the next question. All right, so we've got genetics looks like the biggest, age, alcohol, environment, smoking, contamination, hereditary, HPV, that's a good one, infection. That's a good list. Although contamination and pollutants, environmental, but genetics really is the largest one. So we're going to move to the next question. So again, this is the pretty version, then we'll do the practical version in the next slide. So what is cancer? Is it, and I know these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, so just pick the answer that most resonates to you. What you think is the best answer? It's a disease of dysregulated cells, or a genetic disease, or an unnatural disease brought on by toxins in the environment. Let's go ahead and open up the poll. Oh, I think, can we, people have already started. All right, well, a disease of dysregulated cells, you're definitely healthcare providers, because that's really how we think of it. There's normal cell controls, genetic disease, of course. There are cancers that are genetically based. Not everyone thinks, though, of the main answer for cancer as genetic disease. And then really the last wording for answer C is a lot of what I heard as a cancer educator. That we didn't have cancer before contact with Westerners, and now we have a lot. So it's unnatural and new. And the environment had definitely changed in Alaska. All right, so we'll call here the majority of you again really felt it's a disease of dysregulated cells. Now, what we're going to do, if you can get out a browser and Google, all right, I keep trying to use this. Just Google what causes cancer. So if you were a community member and you were curious and you use Google, ask Dr. Google, as they say. So the first result I got was from the National Cancer Institute, which is good. I know Google is trying to be better about using reputable sources to come higher in the search results. But they squarely state that, and that's why I put it in a square, cancer is a genetic disease. This is how they explain cancer. So that was less than 10% of the answers, I believe, that you all just gave. But this is the the National Cancer Institute's framework. Now, they fill in that framework with 3 points. So the sentence is I use their same formatting. So genetic changes that cause cancer can happen because. So the first because is of errors that occur as cells divide. The second of damage to DNA caused by harmful substances in the environment, such as chemicals in tobacco smoke or UV rays from the sun. So no mentions of toxic pollution from not outside, the natural sunlight, but they're framing the environment as affecting the genes for this genetic disease that then is cancer. And then the last one is they were inherited from our parents, which of course we all know is possible. It's fortunately generally rare, but that is an option. So our next poll everywhere question is then, is this National Cancer Institute definition ideal for explaining cancer to communities? Just let that unfold. And I was going to say Native communities, but really any communities. And I will tell you, as I traveled around the country when I was a cancer educator, I would constantly hear, I live in a cancer cluster. They could be in Kansas, they could be in New Jersey, they could be in Maine. And it just seemed like there was a lot of concerns of cancer clusters. But I think we're here in 100% agreement. So it's good to start with consensus early in the talk, that explaining to communities that cancer is a genetic disease may be going to create some confusion. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here, and I'll talk you through some of what I learned when I was a cancer educator in Alaska before I went to med school. So I did things backwards. Like on the top 5 list, I got to med school late in life, which you really should get around to it when you're young. But I enjoyed a wonderful career as a health educator with a master's degree, and it just was, especially going to tumor board and trying to figure out what was happening. That's what actually inspired me to go to med school, because I felt like if I can't understand what's happening, I can't really share with the community how they can make things better. And I will tell you also, just on a side note, I struggled in histology because everything was so orderly. And I was used to seeing the pink and purple blobs and random words like aplastic at tumor board, and the neat rows of cells were a little bit disconcerting once I got to med school. So, but the first thing that I did is I need to look up what causes cancer. How do I explain cancer? And so, and this is where clearly I was a master's student, not yet a medical student, because my favorite article was in Scientific American. And these authors actually had also written or edited several books that went into more detail of what it is, but I just loved the simple way that they explained cancer risk. And they felt that tobacco and diet were equally about 30% each of the cancer risk, as well as there being a natural risk of cancer, which is something that even at the time I hadn't seen discussed at all. And that we need to have cells in order to have new cells, so new skin coming in, your hair growing, you've got to have your DNA copied, and that can lead to problems. So I actually developed a whole workshop for this, and I'm just going to briefly explain it to you here, because it isn't really the focus of this talk, but just to give you a sense. So I would have just 8 base pairs of DNA to be copied, and it was a very simple setup with just cardboard and pipe cleaners with different colors so you could match up the bases. because if you think about it, if you just have two colors for the different combinations of base pairs, which is only two, so you just need four colors. Then if you took apart an 8 base pair, you would have the blueprint to copy it, right? And that's essentially the same thing that that the body does. So I would have two teams. We would have one set in the middle, and then the two teams would try and copy the cells. And I would always have a quality assurance person, and they would be looking over each team, and there was always an error. And I'll tell you, the one time where it was a complete mess. I mean, these are pipe cleaners, so they're bendable and things happen, but it was just a ball. It was a mess, and that was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers team. Never a dull moment. Nevertheless, this I took what was presented to me in this article, which I believe came from large epidemiologic studies like the Framingham study. And basically they said, environmental risk is real, but it's a very small contributor, less than 5% probably. So then as I did look through the literature, and I kept seeing cited in peer review articles, a New Yorker article, and I thought, what is this? What? I don't understand. Turns out that early in his fame, Atul Gawande wrote an excellent piece called The Cancer Cluster Myth for the New Yorker. And so this, the main point of this article is that it's human nature to think we've got to find a pattern, and especially when it's potentially fatal. Of course, people are going to look for where there's something that lines up, and they can say, look, here's a cluster, we should look at it. And he uses the analogy of it's like shooting at a barn and then painting a target around where the shot hit. So that actually was a really helpful article, even though the New Yorker is not something you would normally see when you're trying to figure out what causes cancer or how to work with communities. But this was one of the most helpful articles. So then I'd done my research and I went to hit the road. This is actually Canada. You can see it's in kilometers here. But it's actually quite complicated to travel in Alaska, not just because there might be reindeer on the road. And this is a nice paved road. This actually is the Alaska-Canada highway. But I wanted to emphasize just the logistics of this so you could understand some of what's happening. So here is, if you took Alaska and put it on the map of the U.S., it would span coast to coast. And point out, of course, you all there in North Carolina. And then just for reference, there's Rhode Island. Okay. So, I mean, I'm here in the middle. Nebraska's covered up. But, this goes from the very tippy top, that's Minnesota, all the way to Florida and out to California. So that's a lot of space to cover. And just by the numbers, and I have to say, so this is the continental U.S. square footage. So we're not even including square footage of Alaska or the square miles. So Alaska is 21% of the continental U.S. square miles. You all there in North Carolina are a whopping 1.7%. The second largest state is Texas at 8.6%, and then good old Rhode Island is 0.04%. But Alaska and Rhode Island have the same number of miles of road. I'm going to say that again. Alaska at 21% of the continental U.S. has the same number of miles of road as Rhode Island, which is 0.4% of the U.S., at least the continental U.S. So, yeah, that's a lot of areas that don't have roads. Now, I thought this would be a fun exercise. So go ahead and look, and you can put any answers you find in the chat. Try and get transportation to one of the villages that I actually went to when I was a cancer educator. It's called Malak. It's in the Bethel area. And again, you can, if you do find something, you can put it in the chat. So Malak has 277 people who live there. It's near Bethel, Alaska, which is where my mom was born in the 1940s, in the midst of TB epidemic. And at the time, Bethel had one of the highest rates of infant mortality in the world. So I'm lucky that I exist. I'm lucky that my family exists, because it was pretty precarious. It's pretty far from Anchorage, which has about half of Alaska's population. Now, see, no one has posted yet a number. I tried to put this in Expedia and just got 0. If you want to try and make it simpler, you can look up Alaska Air or Ryan Air and see if you can find something. I'll put that in the chat. I'll put it to everyone. Alaska Air is really wonderful. Ryan Air does more of the rural. Yeah, so I'm still not seeing anyone founding. So I will tell you the way that I got there back in probably 2000 was by snowmobile, which the health director at the Bethel Hospital took out of the repair shop. Our other option was his dog team. That was how you got to Ethmala. And that was an interesting one, because most of the people in attendance weren't English speakers. So we had a translator, and I don't think when things went well, because the translator I would say 2 sentences, and then 5 minutes later the translator would be done. So I'm not really sure that went very well. But I went out there. I did that. So you may be saying to yourself, all right, pristine Alaska without a lot of access to most of the state, how could people worry about, say, toxins? It doesn't make sense. And here's why you're wrong to start with. Alaska, and for those of you who are interested in military, of course, everyone knows that Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese, but there was actually U.S. soil that was occupied during World War II. And if you feel like you can look up that history, I won't give a spoiler alert, but it was in Alaska. So at the time, of course, planes were very important in the Pacific War, and many of these villages had some sort of makeshift runway, and they just popped up a lot of military use of those runways and expansion. And they actually built the picture I had with the reindeer in the road. The Alaska-Canada Highway was built specifically in World War II to help with the war. So, transportation took a major shift. And of course, it's wartime. People were in a hurry. And probably the biggest contributor to cancer risk from this World War II sudden military presence in Alaska was that often soldiers would share their sea rations, which included cigarettes. So probably not the best thing. But there was also transformers that were left sometimes near the water supply, and large barrels that were still there when I was traveling around in the late 90s of who knows what, again, some of which was in the water supply. So that was just one of the obvious places where you could see that there was a problem. So to really summarize, not only there's these makeshift airstrips and barrels of pollution, but there was also, and it's human nature, and we certainly have seen this play out in the pandemic, people have a hard time trusting what they can't see. So if you tell them, oh, don't worry about what's in the environment, because we did these large studies with a bunch of people and we would have seen regional differences, and we didn't. So, environmental risks are not really a valid concern. And they're like, but we can't see it. We just know that things aren't the way they used to be, and we have more cancer now. So, maybe there's something in the fish, or the other wildlife. Like halibut, I don't know if anybody's had beer fried halibut. It's quite delicious. But those are bottom feeders, and they literally are bottom feeders. They are one of the few fish with both eyes on the top, so they literally go along the bottom of the ocean with both eyes looking up for prey. So they can accumulate quite a bit of mercury. But this is, in spite of the fact, around at that time, around half of adult Alaska Natives were smokers, and I think it's still quite high today, that they were still more worried about the environment. So I had this, that's when I really put together in my mind that there was this chasm. And it was not so much time, but now I see this more, the community perspective, and this is not a monolith. Obviously, there's a wide variety of views, but I did often hear this, and again, from natives and non-natives, that they were worried the environment was killing them with cancer. And then on the healthcare side, they were like, well, just tell them to stop smoking, and can we study them because we think they're more closely related genetically, so maybe we'll find a new gene that might be contributing to cancer risk. That's the chasm. So you might say, well, people are just being paranoid. I will remind you that there was a study 2 weeks ago, and I don't know if anybody saw this, if you want to mention it in the chat, but again, this January 17th, 2023, there was a study published that there were these forever chemicals found in freshwater fish in the continental U.S. Now, I'm not showing the main study. I'm showing some of the media coverage because it's fascinating. So this is from WebMD, and they actually take quite a bit. They first explain what the chemicals are that were found, and then they start talking about the risk. But what I found even more fascinating is that the Hill picked up, now this is a political, it's literally the Capitol Hill focused site, and they covered it and immediately started with the levels of these chemicals that are concerning. And it's 2,400 times, if you eat one freshwater fish, it's 2,400 times greater than what's recommended by the EPA for a whole month. So that's and I'm not sure that I may not have gotten those numbers quite right, but it's an excessive amount of these forever chemicals that they found in fish. So you can say, well, they're just being paranoid, but I would argue, probably the environment is not the entire cause of cancer. However, we don't do a good job of focusing on it in research, and we don't do a good job of responding to communities. And I include myself in that, with their concerns. And it's hard because, again, Atul Gawande put it very succinctly that, when we see a few cases, it's human nature to pull those together. And sometimes there is something there, but for the most part, there probably isn't. But we still should be responsive. And that's where I think the communities are being let down. So I just want to take a few minutes. And again, as I explained at the top there, this is not your standard talk because this is not literature based. Some of this just isn't in the literature, but as a native researcher, and I'm Athabascan, from just north of Bethel, Alaska. That's where my family's from. I get asked, my colleagues get asked, can you connect us with tribes because we want to study any genes that might be involved in cancer risk? And this, I'm going to give a visual response, and then I'll explain the context. Yeah, don't do this. So this is me as a first-year Harvard med student. I was coordinating the Four Directions Summer Research Program, which, if anybody's interested, definitely consider applying for those who are native pre-meds. We bring them to Harvard for the summer, put them in a research lab. It's a great experience. We do a lot with them, as well as providing a letter of recommendation on Harvard Med School, stationery. All these things matter. But one of our activities was going to Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts, and I should include an area in the Wampanoag part of the Plymouth Plantation, but here I am in the English settlers cabin, and it was so hot that day. It was 90s and super humid, like a lot of North Carolina summer days. And that man was wearing heavy wool. So I was trying to cool down and also just in utter disbelief of what was happening. But this really does capture the feelings of myself and a lot of other Native researchers, for those who are thinking like, hey, can we come study the genes? And rather than just saying you shouldn't do that, let me back up and give you a reason that there isn't a lot of trust. So we're going to go back to Alaska for a minute. This little tiny island, sorry, it's not coming through very clearly. It's St. Lawrence Island, and it's between Alaska and Russia and the Bering Sea. It does, I couldn't find a map with the international date line, but the community in the western side of this island is 5 miles from the international date line. So there was a very clever title of a study called 5 Miles from, or I should say a publication, 5 Miles from Tomorrow. So immediately it has made this community identifiable, even though the author does not specifically mention which community it is. But it doesn't take long to figure out that that's what he's talking about. It was published in JAMA in 2000. And it was a story of a Siberian Yupik, and I'm going to show you it in the next slide and just read the first couple of paragraphs. It's pretty blatant. But saying that that this community had a tradition of, if you feel useless or you don't want to be a drag on the community, that you can have community permission to commit suicide, and that there's a ceremony and goodbyes are said, and then you just walk out onto the ice and are never heard from again. So the author was trying to make sense, and he was a med student when he visited this community. He was just saying, like, there are different approaches to death. However, the attending physician who had worked in that community for a decade at the time said, there was no such patient. There was no such tradition. This is fictitious. And I do say, if you do look this up, it is interesting. The editors at JAMA really throw this author under the bus and say, because his reply to the attending was that, I'd heard this might have been a tradition and I wanted to capture it, but I knew there was such a small word limit that I needed to make up a patient in order for it to be a vehicle to make the point. And then the editor said, at no point did he explain that this was not a real patient. So it was only retracted last year, and I had been trying for 5 years to get this retracted, because I would present it to my public health students, and most of whom were Native, and it was a tough class. There was a lot of anger about this article. So, and one of them actually from North Carolina had been taught this example, this very paper, as how some Native people deal with death. So even though there was a good exchange after the paper was published, people are still taking it at face value. So it was actually the author who retracted, although if you look at it, it's one of those, I'm sorry if you're offended, but I still don't fully understand why you would be offended. Nevertheless, it's been retracted. And this brings up a point. The patient, particularly, I don't think this would occur today because it's better, it's tighter in terms of having patient permission. So now, if this had been submitted, someone at JAMA would say we need permission from the patient or their legal authority, and obviously none existed, so that would have come out. The problem here, though, is the very title identifies the community, and there isn't protection from the community. And this is why and I don't know what the situation is in North Carolina, especially with the Eastern Band of Cherokee, but many tribes are creating their own version of an institutional review board, often called a research review board, and they tend to have broader powers because they're not just trying to protect patients or participants in research, they're trying to protect the community from things like this. So, and again, this is a particularly egregious, and my favorite response to this was from the British Medical Journal ethics review of unethical research practices actually cites this paper, and this was even before it was retracted, as a problematic paper. But my favorite sentence here, to really be concerning, the village, an Arctic afterthought of a human settlement, makes Timbuktu feel metropolitan. So this is someone who's very much judging this community. Anyway. So let's switch gears, and I want to talk about, I tried to work with our outreach librarian, which we're very excited to have now at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, which is who someone in a Native community in Nebraska might go to say, like, hey, are we having cancer risk? And these are the search parameters that she used. And we really did not come up with anything helpful. And I just put the first two up here. They're also in the reference slide, that the simplicity of the 1996 Scientific American article laying out the risks and really quantifying them is no longer easy to find. But it's not a simple thing. The research literature is not giving us simple ways to work with communities. So I want to pause here. So the summer before med school, we were asked to take a photo of us studying. We were given a neuroanatomy workbook to study in the summer, and they, take pictures of interesting places that you were studying. So here I am at a powwow again, I think when I was coordinating 4 directions. And I think there's ways that we can, and it doesn't just apply to Native communities, but a lot of disenfranchised communities or underrepresented, however you want to put that overall term, where they're really not as connected as we'd like to be to either healthcare or research. There are ways to take this information and make it appealing to a group. And this is what I learned as a cancer educator, and I certainly have been reinforced in my clinical training, that it's always best to have someone who can speak from experience to be the spokesperson. So when I when I left the job to go off to med school, the funding had ended, so I ended up making a video of the workshop, and it was really a lot of fun. And definitely, the Mayo Clinic paid for this. I still don't believe that they let me do this. I totally went native and out there. So the immune system, for instance, is a high school kid in a bear suit. There's a DNA repairman. We had Mr. Butts, which is a giant cigarette costume that knocks over the DNA, and the DNA repairman has to fix it up. So, and I made my brother be the narrator because he's a cancer survivor. So, that, even though I'm not sure that the information is correct anymore, it was a very native way to tell the story. And when I presented it to our board, I had that version, and then I had a separate video just of answers to the most common questions that I got when I was traveling throughout Alaska over those 2 years. And the board absolutely hated that video. Even though I got the experts in the state and the most common questions, and they were like, we like that fun one with the bear. So that's the only one that we ended up using. But my point is, if you want to get involved with Native communities, bring somebody from that community who's trusted, and to help. They can be true to their roots, but also bring in this new information. This particular example is neuroanatomy, but for cancer. And then there are a few areas for additional research. And again, this is not the standard talk that you would hear, but we really need to be more responsive to community concerns and understand, have a better system for saying, this is a community concern over fish, if there's a lot of fish, and we don't have toxicologists to help sort that out. And there, of course, at the time when I was a cancer educator, I did find some clusters of cancer in Turkey that were attributed to asbestos-like fibers in the soil and surrounding area. But there's not a lot other than, say, Aaron Brockovich, who is obviously a dramatic example of a cancer cluster in the U.S. But I do think for research interests, and I haven't had a chance to really look at this, but are there, am I missing something? Is there Native communities who have been the source of genetic risks, or is this the research equivalent of a treasure hunt? And I'm just not sure. And the last one is, trying to find the estimate of the risks. I think most of that is not in the literature for articles. I think you have to go to texts on the epidemiology of cancer and cancer risks. But I will offer, and my contact information is going to be at the end, if anybody's interested in potentially writing this up as a paper, I would be happy to help, because I just feel like the differences are so far apart in what the community expects to hear from, or to have healthcare and research be responsive to, and what healthcare wants to do and the research world is focused on. They're just very far apart. So here are my references. Again, I would hope that someone has done, and if you want to look up Atul Gawande's article, because I just wanted to find the website, but then as I scrolled down, I found that there were quite a few rebuttals of this. So like people were taking pot shots, even more modern history, because that was published in 99. So, that's apparently still relevant and still being take an aim at. So it's clearly a sore spot, and it is frustrating to me that this isn't more discussed in the literature. I have the WebMD and the Hill story, and then Sheetal Shah's 5 Miles from Tomorrow is in JAMA. And then I put a couple of the references from the search it was found, and I will say it's been a fascinating time. The reason on my top 5 list that I thought the reason that I was on the status list, which is the Boston Globe's movers and shakers, so that included the CEO of Pfizer and Moderna, as well as Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, and some pretty heavy hitters, and there were only 48 of us. I thought it was because I had exactly one Twitter rant, and it was against Howard Bachner, who at the time was the head of JAMA. And for those of you who aren't aware, I won't go into a lot of details, but there was a structural racism podcast put out by JAMA that was really more a demonstration of structural racism rather than a productive explanation. And it was CME credit. And that eventually led to him no longer being editor-in-chief, and they brought in an African-American woman, Dr. Bibbins Gonzalez, I believe is her name, who's a specialist in DEI work. So I have seen much better things coming from JAMA as a result of that. But, I don't necessarily, I usually find another way, but this was just a particularly egregious example where leadership was not coming through. And even though he didn't necessarily personally approve it, it happened under his watch, and his response did not help to further repair the questionable race practices at JAMA. So those are some references to take with you. I will close out here and we can move on. This is my email. Please feel free to reach out. And I will just say this beating I did for an Association of American Indian Physicians conference. It was for the cover of the page. And with that, I will turn it over for questions, comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wescott. That was very informative and impactful. I think your point about kind of the gap in perspective between communities and researchers is really well made, and something that we struggle with all the time. And just to note that folks can add questions at that Poll Everywhere link, and so but it's like there's a need to find a balance, right? We definitely need to pay attention to the needs and priorities of the community members. At the same time, part of the journey towards finding treatments and making sure that current treatments are effective for everyone from diverse backgrounds also requires doing some of those genetics, investigation and genetic work, and not developing risk prediction scores and therapies that are only based on, a certain part of the population. So, at both ends, very important work being done, and definitely a need to prioritize as we think about the science and the genomics and all the other questions. How do we also elevate and incorporate and address the concerns of the community, right?
Okay, well, I see the first question is, can you please explain more about forever chemicals? And I cannot. I'm not familiar with what my brief level of understanding is that they don't degrade as other chemicals will, and that's why they're called forever chemicals. And it's harder to get them out of both water and wildlife. And so that's the exactly what effects they might have on health, I'm not familiar with, but again, that's why we need a better system to help explore exactly what risks that poses. When do you decide? Oh, this is boy, that's a tough one. When are they a cancer patient and when are they a survivor? I am not qualified to answer that. I will just say that I don't know that anyone has ever not have cancer associated with them if they've been diagnosed with it. Even my brother, it was a squamous cell carcinoma, and the margins were clear, so he didn't undergo extensive treatment. But nonetheless, he always has to be concerned about any skin lesion. So I don't know the answer to that, and maybe that's something that can be addressed at a future one of these talks.
And I think the current guidance is, thinking about survivorship from the moment of diagnosis, right? I'm thinking about what are the unique health needs of cancer patients starting from while they're still actively in treatment and then the rest of the post-treatment period as well.
Okay. Could you provide suggestions about how to discuss a new cancer diagnosis? Okay, so I did a rotation. I actually wanted to go into Peds Hemonc before I decided instead to go back into public health. So I did a rotation just at Children's Hospital in Boston on either new diagnoses of cancer or a case that has taken a turn and needs a new workup. So discussing cancer diagnoses could be a whole fascinating exploration. And I've heard from oncologists that, they could write a book on just what happens after you say we've diagnosed cancer. And there's a full range of things that happened. I think the best approach when you're dealing with someone whom you don't share cultural identity and you feel like you don't have a good sense of what that cultural identity might be, you just know it's not the same, is to really ask them, how can I help you understand this? And it may not be at the very first diagnosis. And I'm of the school that you should approach what can we do before you answer questions of how did we get here, because it gives people hope. And then any suggestions you might have for those in healthcare and what we can do to get started to help closing the gap. Well, and I would think that anyone, whether they're at the front desk or it's a nurse taking blood pressure or it's a public health nurse making home visits, and all the way up the levels of healthcare workers, is to find out through comments, key informant interviews, whatever, level of funding or not funding that you have, is to see if you're currently meeting the needs of concerns about cancer. And I guess this could be done in, I think it's every 3 years, there's a community assessment that every hospital system needs to do. That may be the place for this. If there isn't separate funding, that just ask, like, take the temperature. Or are we meeting your needs to understand what's happening in cancer? Because otherwise, I really think that this is an area that is just not the way we usually approach the question. So it just doesn't fit well into current research. I know it's not the most satisfying answer, but it's a tough issue. That's why I'm here talking about it. At least trying to let you know that it exists.
Thank you. Any other questions? And there's a request for the CME link in the chat. John or Andrew, if you could put that in there.
Yeah, and if anyone can tell me just how bad this Diet Mountain Dew is for me.
Also, I put in a chat a link to PFAS or the forever chemicals if anyone is interested in reading a little bit more about what those are. Okay, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your presentation and call to action and charge for us to ask and make sure that we are meeting the needs of the Native tribal communities in the course of our work, whatever that is. And I think that is a lesson we will continue to think about and incorporate as we go along. I think we have the thank you slide. Just a quick note that the next SciSep webinar will be in May, and we have a great presentation scheduled for then. We hope you can join us as well. We'll be sharing more details as time comes closer. And a list of all the past presentations can be found at this website at the unclcn.org/SciSep website if you want to catch up. And, we have information on our website about this partnership between Duke, UNC, and Wake Forest. So if you're interested in learning more, you can visit our website at scicep.org. Okay, and with that, thank you so much again, Dr. Wescott, and thanks to everyone for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate your time today.